right. So welcome back to the Primas podcast. I am Cindy, and that's my prima, Jess.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Cindy.
Hi, Jess. Sometimes we do that. We will say hi to each other.
Good morning. Drinking my coffee this morning.
We're big coffee drinkers. So joining us today, our special guest, Karla Carranza, who is a licensed clinical social worker and addiction specialist. Karla, welcome to the Primas podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much to both of you. I'm really excited.
Yay, welcome.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you for doing this episode with us. This is an important episode that we've been trying to get off the ground since the beginning. And I think it hits home with, our communities because we all either know someone or maybe struggle ourselves with addiction. Today, we're going to focus particularly on substance use. But I think it's all encompassing, right? Because when you have an addictive personality, you can become addicted to shopping, to food, to pornography, gambling. And so I like to debunk those kind of stereotypes where it's like, maybe someone's addicted to heroin and someone's addicted to, shopping. It's still kind of trauma-based. And so, but we say, oh no, you're a junkie if you're addicted to, this heroin, but you're not a junkie if you're addicted to food. And it's like, no one's a junkie, right? No one's a junkie. How can we understand addiction better? So this is a big one for us. I was really kind of nervous and I was getting ready for it. So
Yeah, we've been wanting to talk about the substance use for a long time because it's continuous in our healing journey, like we're always talking about it, and not until recently where we're really starting to understand it, because not only do we work in this line where we're helping clients who abuse, but within our own upbringing, we're starting to connect the dots. So that's why it was very challenging for us, because it's just wait a second, we're barely connecting the dots within ourselves. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of hard to see and step back and self-reflect a lot, and understand, why we wanted to talk about this topic.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think for me in my journey, I've always had such a one-sided view on substance use and addiction, because that came from my parents and what their understanding is of substance abuse and addictions. But it wasn't until I was able to do my own research and really understand the dynamics behind addiction and substance use that I was even able to say, wow, my whole idea of substance abuse, addiction, was actually never right. It was incredibly wrong. And I think a lot of folks have this idea of substance abuse and addiction that we've been fed, right? That we've been fed within our society, and we all believe, like what you both just said, that folks are just junkies, that people can just stop whenever they want to, but that's really not true.
Mm-hmm. And so why do people do drugs? That's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to go over explaining the trauma-based impacts of drug use, because there's way more to the story when someone is using drugs. It's not what we see. It's so much deeper. Both me and Jess work in the area of homelessness prevention. And so a lot of our clients, which makes sense, right, Jess? I don't know about you, but of course, you're in the streets, especially if you're a family or you're a woman. And it's kind of easy to bond to a drug so that you can make it from living in the streets. You're so vulnerable, and we don't see it that way. We also hear a lot of negative stereotypes about homeless people. Well, if they wanted to, they could just get up and work. They're being lazy, right? All of this negative stuff where it's man, it's just so much deeper once you get to learn the stories of these, these families, and you're thinking, no, it's not. No. And if you were in that position, if you were dealt with these cards in this life, and from the jump, you didn't have an opportunity, a support system, no one to keep you safe, then you can start connecting the dots, like you said, where it's man, I can see myself being in that position, right? Because we speak from a place of privilege when we say a junkie, or they can just get up and work. And it's we can't even fathom, because we grew up into a home, we grew up with a family. And we take those things for granted because there are some people that don't, that grow up straight into the foster care system and just worse, right? I mean, there's billions of stories. So we're going to talk about how abuse is trauma based, and then also debunk negative stereotypes, and then as always provide some solutions. And so before we get right into it, I wanted to ask you, Karla, what got you interested in getting into this field of specializing in addiction and social work?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was honestly a little bit of fate, and I'll explain. I actually never, ever, ever in my whole life knew that getting a master's degree was even an opportunity for myself. Um, I kid you not, I didn't even know that that even existed until I was an undergrad. And while I was an undergrad, there was the opportunity for me to take a substance abuse class. It was very kind of more informative and very basic information that I think at that time was kind of like the initial spark. But like you both have mentioned, substance abuse and addictions run deep within our families. And there have been a lot of issues in terms of addictions and alcoholism within my own family. And I've watched somebody that I used to care for so much kind of deteriorate so quickly. And it got me thinking, like, how do I support this person, and how do I support the rest of the people who are dealing with these situations? And I was thinking, to myself, like, what are some opportunities for people of color, for marginalized groups to get support with substance use? And there's not really a lot. And so I kind of thought to myself, maybe this is a sign that I need to find a way to support my community, to support folks who are needing me, to help them through some of these difficulties, and be the one person who understands where they're coming from, instead of judging them, instead of crucifying them for something that can be, and it is, out of their hands sometimes. So that's kind of how that developed. And while I was in grad school, the opportunity came up for me to do an internship for a community health center. And the focus was on medicated assisted treatment, which I can talk about later on. And that kind of sparked it all. I was like, okay, this is totally something that I'm into. I am very passionate about it. There's just so much information out there that I think is important for folks to know. And I want to be that one specific person who, at least in my community, has the opportunity to share that with folks. So that's kind of how that started.
Wow. Thank you for that. It sounds like a calling, right? It kind of took you to that place, and that's really nice. Thank you for your work, because you see younger folks as well, right? Like, what are the age groups that you work with? I remember you telling me that.
Yeah, definitely. Oh my gosh, I think within the field that I'm in right now, anywhere between 16 to like 70s. There's a wide range of folks.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I remember,
definitely.
because you just, you assume, oh, these are older people, and it's just like, no, there's younger kids as well, right? Like, they're just young. People start young because they need
Mhm.
something,
Yeah,
right? They need
yeah,
something to attach to.
Yeah.
yeah,
Their ways of
definitely.
coping.
Yeah, absolutely. A coping mechanism. Absolutely. Especially when we grow up in households that are not supportive of who we are, of our decisions. Oftentimes in our culture, we're very like family oriented, which is not a bad thing, absolutely not. But in some ways, it can be a barrier to who we want to be, and to be able to spread our wings and kind of do our thing. It's not necessarily something that is well received within our culture, and we're often looked at as a bad guy, right, for wanting to do something other than take care of our family. And I think sometimes that can be a huge piece in why younger folks start using substances as a way to escape from the stressors of even having that as something that you have to do within your life, and it's not necessarily a choice that you were able to make for yourself.
Yeah. I really like this author. His name is, oh, guys. Anyways, it doesn't matter because I'll bring it up. Oh, Johan Hari. He talks a lot about exactly what you were explaining, where it's an escape, but also as humans, we are here to thrive. And the way in which we thrive is by community or by tribes, by villages, by seeking out social interactions and bonds. And I loved the way that he explained it was like bees. Bees are, they're here to create and like the beehive, and they work as a group. And if one bee isn't, a part of that, not that bees get depressed, but he was kind of explaining it in the human way, where it's just like if you get detached from your community for safety reasons, for abuse reasons, for whatever it is, you are no longer functioning. And so because we're kind of like driven to bond, then we bond to these drugs or anything else, right, that we create an unhealthy attachment to. And so I really like that explanation, because it kind of explains our human tendency to create relationships, and how that looks like today with all of the technology and social media, where it's like, oh, I have 400 friends on my Facebook or on my Instagram, but who do you call really? Who do you have to call in a moment of crisis? In a real moment of crisis, most people, there's a lot of studies and research say they have like one person. And in the 50s, it was like 5-10 people. And so social media, I feel like, has created this illusion that we're bonding, but we're not. And I think that goes back to when you look at younger people getting addicted, it's like they need to attach to something. Like it's that's a better way to look at it, versus like, oh, he's just being an irresponsible person. And it's just like, no, he wasn't, or she wasn't able to attach or create a healthy bond with mom, dad, whoever. And now they're bonding to this substance that is providing momentary relief to our symptoms of loneliness, basically, is what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that that's a huge piece. Oftentimes I talk about attachments and the attachment styles um, that we have because of the people that we grow up with. Our attachment to relationships as an adult really come from the attachments that we have from our caregivers. So it's not necessarily our parents, but whoever, took care of us growing up. And if they were emotionally neglectful or if they were abusive, we're seeing this view, right, as a child, like it's okay for folks to hurt me because they love me, right? And in turn, when they start to grow up, they see a different perspective, and it's hard to come to the conclusion that I went through such a difficult experience. And I think oftentimes that's when we see the look for comfort. Where can I find that comfort? Where can I find that escape? And it's always easier for us to escape with the use of substance.
Yeah. One thing that have you guys heard the experiment of Rat Park, where they kind of like make the experiment of they put a rat in a cage and they isolate him, right? It's just a rat in a cage, and then there's like a water tube he can drink from, and then there's like either heroin or coke infused water he can drink from. And so the rat would always take the coke or heroin infused water, and then to the point where it killed itself. It just created like that addiction pattern or whatever. And so a lot of early studies on addiction were based off of this model. And then later in life, other psychologists came up and were like, wait a minute, what if we created rat heaven, where there's tunnels that can go around, colors, balls, mates, so that they can, have sex, socialize, and just food, a happy, healthy environment, and then see how they take to the drug infused water. And so the rat would, once it was happier, because it was in rat heaven, it would almost never go to the drug infused water. It would always it's happy now. And so they said, well, what if that study is particular to rats, right? And during the Vietnam War, a lot of the soldiers were using heroin. Like 20% of the soldiers were using heroin, and everyone's like, what are we going to do? They're going to come back. We're going to have zombies everywhere. It's going to be horrible. But almost 95% of soldiers that came back, if they came back to a healthy, loving environment with their families, partners, kids, food, right? Like they were no longer in this heightened state of stress from a war, and they stopped using. And so there's a lot of research that goes into that. And anytime I, think about where we are today with substance use and how we view people who use substances is, you can't not talk about the war on drugs, which for me, that's when I learned a lot about like incarceration and how a lot of people are nonviolent and they have like life terms or like 40, 50 years because they caught them with, either smoking crack or, whatever. And if they give them, let's say they give you like a 45-year sentence and you get out and you're still kind of young. Well, now you have a criminal record. And now you can't just go out and get whatever job you want. And so we shame drug users. And that's what the war on drug did. It was, and this isn't my opinion, you guys, we always say in this podcast, do your own research. There's a lot of research now on the war on drugs. There's YouTube videos, there's TED Talks, documentaries, but it was very much race-based. It was very ignorant. It didn't have any solutions to the problem. It said, we're going to shame you. We're going to put you in jail. And then that created so much other ripple effects, like the violence that goes on in Mexico, for example, China, all these other places that continue to produce drugs. And so studying the war on drugs, I think, is a big part of the solution, because you'll get to see how, especially in our culture, especially our older generations, how they still demonize marijuana. And they put marijuana in the same place where they put meth and heroin and crack. And it's just like, whoa, very different situations. But the war on drugs was so influential because it gave you that message of, no, these people who do drugs are bad. Let's shame them. Let's lock them up, isolate them. And I think that also goes into our homelessness issue. We just continue to shame them.
And that's a good point, Prima. I hear what you're saying. But then my biggest thing is like, yeah, those are very extreme, right? We're talking about like veterans and certain populations and like homeless people. But my thing is like, let's look and analyze at your everyday goers, who abuse some sort of substance and it's normalized. That to me is more trippier than like, yeah, we're going to shame and look down on these, but these individuals went through so much trauma. But what about those like everyday people who are family members, who are still like maintaining these jobs, who use and abuse these substances? And to me, maintaining that to me is more of an injustice, because it's just like, how like the system still continue to let everyone down, not just these populations, not just veterans, not just homelesses, it's our community members. And it's normalized. It's just like, okay, well, I have a job. I still have my apartment. So I'm like better than these the homeless population. You know what I mean? It's this higher chains of ranks. And to me, like trip me out. Like, I don't understand how we look down on other people when it's like, where's that self-reflection? Where's like, well, what are you doing? You know what I mean? Like, you come home to do this every day, whether that's alcohol, whether that's your own form of like coping mechanisms. But here we are as the community, like, yeah, still that judgment, right? And that's what I want to break down. And I love the Disney movie Alice in like Wonderland, and just the concepts behind that, because I'm like, we're all mad down here. We're all crazy. We're all struggling. It's all of us. It's not just certain populations, And I think we divide that. We put these big like walls in between us, but it's just like we're all struggling. Right? When I think of substance use, I just don't think of like certain populations. I think like within my little small, like immediate, like you said, Prima, my immediate family, you know what I mean? And I can't even answer or have solutions for that. How am I going to fix the rest of the world? How am I going to change everyone else when it's so prevalent in my small little network?
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like high functioning drug addicts, right? That are able to maintain I don't know, like a social appearance. And it's like I have it together. I have my doctorate degree, I have my master's degree, I'm working, but I come home and I drink every day. And essentially I'm an alcoholic. That's a great point. What's your take on that? Like,
Yeah.
Karla, like how do we begin to understand when it's so immediate, I guess? How can we have more empathy, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
part of the solutions.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the main pieces is that we need to personalize, right? Like there has to be a personalization of these stories because if I'm looking outside, right? Like I'm an outside perspective, I'm just seeing people who use substances, right? I see people who use substances and are homeless, and then I see people who use substances and have jobs. But if we look very closely, if we magnify into these cases of people who use substances and have housing, there is a lot of deep internal problems, whether that's with relationships, typically that's where I see the most problems. And there's, the specific like internalized um, trauma that comes from family dynamics. And these are things that are being passed on from generation to generation. And there's this really great book. I mentioned this to you, Cindy. It's called Buzzed. And
Oh
it
my
talks about,
gosh.
yeah,
I
it's
was gonna
so good.
wait, was that the book you were telling me about, Prima?
No.
No.
No? Okay, because there was that someone told me about this book, or I did research because I was gonna do it, and it talks about the way like the alcohol advertises towards women specifically.
Yeah, so they talk a lot about advertisements actually, and
Yeah.
how this is part of the problem, right? That we advertise these substances, in particular alcohol, because that's what we find most susceptible in our society, right? But I want to read some of the quotes on here because I think it hits it right on the nail in this topic. It says, the gap between scientific information and public information is growing hour by hour, right? There's a disconnect between what is true, like the facts, and what the public knows, and really what like our society wants us to know. And there's a unique disconnect between the scientific facts and the public's perception about drug abuse and addiction. If we're going to make any progress, we have to overcome this great disconnect. So I think one of the biggest problems is that we don't have this information readily available to anyone. This is not something that is being taught anywhere. Truly, if I hadn't gone into this field, I don't think that I would have known any of this. And so these things, these are the problems that are occurring, sorry, within our own communities, right? There's this disconnect in factual information, and instead we're going by what we were taught generations past, right? um, but within our communities, we have these problems that are occurring, and using this false information to continue these stigmas and sometimes even enable some of these behaviors, right? Especially within our community, Latino Hispanic community, when we talk about alcoholism and how acceptable it is for men, especially, to use alcohol because it's just their way of relaxing, or it's just because they're wanting to hang out with family. And those are the problems that we have to address within our community.
Yeah. And I'm very transparent about like my story. I started drinking at like 8th or ninth grade. And I
Mhm.
never knew or like questioned it. I just thought it was so normal because like not only was it in both my parents and then both my grandparents, but it wasn't until like, yeah, college, early college, where I started to like factor in the terms like nature versus nurture. So like not only was it in my DNA because it was in both my parents and both my grandfathers, it was in my environment. I saw it as a kid every week from both my parents. So it was such a strong influence on me. And I'm grateful that I was able to control it. Well, after transitioning into like motherhood is what really opened my eyes. But I would always talk to Cindy and be like, yeah, I think I'm gonna need help. Like I couldn't control it. I would drink to get drunk. You know, happy hour wasn't just a drink for me. It was like drink until I got fucked up. And I look back on it and like, that's how my parents are. They cannot control it. They cannot just have one and be like, okay, I'm cool. Like, I'm gonna just have a glass of wine. And I like inherited, I think, that way of drinking. So yeah, it came from like a lot of self-reflection and growing and like my higher studies, you know, all those were contributing factors to help me understand why I did what I did at such a young age. And I never stopped. Once I started, I was drinking like every weekend. And as I got older, like in high school, it was like 4 or 5 times a week. So it just trips me out, you know, like how it's influenced and like advertised to like our communities. And right, we were talking about this study. We learned about, Cindy and I, that where they said like there's a liquor store in like these lower communities, and there was like 5 liquor stores within my neighborhood who would sell to underage children. You know what I mean? So it's just like, it's so trippy to me how like it's all around us, and it's these institutions that are just setting us up to like become addicted essentially, you know, like if we lived in another neighborhood, there wouldn't be a liquor store in every corner, you know, where it's that much accessible.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I think the same can be true for dispensaries here in Colorado. I mean, I can't go to Highlands Ranch, suburb of Colorado, and find dispensaries, right? But if I go to Five Points, I'm going to find them everywhere. And I'm totally pro, you know, marijuana. That's not necessarily what I'm speaking to, but what does that mean for our communities, right? Like, what does that say about where they want us to continue to be, right? And you're absolutely right. There's a lot of factors that contribute to addiction, and one of them is genetics. This is how, I mean, if we already have a history of addiction in our family, we are at a higher risk of also having an addiction. And it can be towards the same substance, or it could be so totally something different, but that addiction is there, right? Genetics, they don't create a disorder, but they present that risk and that vulnerability as a human to have these disorders. And genes can be altered by life experiences, what we go through, right? If I grow up in an abusive family, I'm going to be at a higher risk of having an addiction. Whereas if I grow up in a family that's loving, that is emotionally stable, and is able to provide that emotional support to me, and not just financially, I am at a higher risk of not having an addiction, but also succeeding, right? And that doesn't mean a success as in like going to college. That's not necessarily what we're focusing on, but more of like successfully being in a place where I'm satisfied with my life and the choices that I'm making. But there's so much more that contributes to that, right? Like who influences me when I'm growing up, the environment that I mentioned earlier that I'm growing up in, the effects of stressors, right, that I'm going through in my life. If I live a life that is in constant stress, or I'm constantly going through impactful experiences, my brain is predisposed to different genetics, right? It's altered, which means that I'm going to be in a place where I'm more predisposed to having an addiction. And then let's, even with that, we're talking about mental disorders, right? Depression, anxiety. If these disorders run in my family, I am also at a higher risk of using substances and having an addiction. But there's just so much to explain, and it's difficult to even put that right in writing where folks can understand that there's so much more than just me deciding that I want to use substances, right? But yeah, thank you so much for sharing that story. I'm grateful to be here to hear that. That must have been so difficult for you to even just come to the conclusion and reflect, like, this has been happening in my life, and also how amazing that you were able to say, I need that help and I'm
Mhm.
ready to change my life. That is honestly amazing.
Yeah, I think motherhood, if it wasn't for me like getting pregnant and like having my daughter, because then I was like, no, I don't want these, like that'll be 4 generations where it'll continue, you know? And I was just like, no, like I needed to stop. And then I had jumped right into like my bachelor's and transferring at Cal State LA also. So that also helped. Like it went hand in hand. My daughter was months old, and then I was already on like the fast track to graduating. So
Wow.
then the education and then all these classes like made me self-reflect, like, nope, like where is this coming from? Just where? And then the year I graduated, which was 2 years ago, then I started doing therapy. So it's just been going hand in hand, like not only learning as like a mother, but like for myself, because I gotta heal the storm within me. Like, why do I keep relying on these depressants, because through my higher education I learned that alcohol is a depressant,
Yeah.
and even though like we think it makes us feel good, it doesn't. It's just
Yeah.
suppressing everything how we're really feeling. So for the last 2 years I've been making myself feel what I've been trying to suppress for like over 15 years, because I was at 30 at that age.
Absolutely.
I'm
And
tackling it.
these substances, including alcohol, are momentary relief, right?
Mhm.
And the moment we drink, it all goes away and it feels great. But long term, it's actually creating problems. And we see that, right? A lot of
Mhm.
people lose their support systems because of their addictions. And unfortunately, that's actually what we need, right? Our support systems to continue to ride with us through these difficulties, because that addiction is always going to be an addiction, and we're always going to need that support from our people, right? Our community. But unfortunately, we burn a lot of bridges sometimes when we have those addictions, and it's difficult to gain that support system, that community back. And that's one of the hardest pieces, right? When I'm working with patients who have an addiction or a substance abuse problem, and there's nobody to support them through this
Mhm.
process. And it's so much harder to continue and move forward, and make progress when there is no support.
Wow, that's deep. And congratulations, Prima, for catching it by yourself, right? I think a lot of the
Mhm.
times where we're breaking these generational cycles, it's like you're on your own.
Mhm.
And it's just powerful because
Mhm.
it's such a it's like you're in a circle, right? Like because you become addicted to something and then that changes your personality. And especially something like alcohol, where that was big in our it's big in our family. With my grandpa, he was so antisocial until he stopped. But like he was a hardcore user all his life. Just
Mhm.
same, like it was normalized. And what what I'm trying to get at is he had a huge influence on all of us. And it's like, how do you deal with when someone, they burn these bridges, right? Like someone close to you hurts you, they disrespect you, not one time, not two times, for years. And it's like, how can we be empathetic to that? I
Mhm.
think where we're struggling, right, Jess, where we're like
Yeah.
seeing our family members get older, and you're like,
Mhm.
but you were so mean, you were
Yeah.
so, you're the cause. That's pointing the finger and
Mhm.
being judgmental. But I feel honestly, right, like that's kind of how we
Mhm.
feel sometimes, like, and we
Mhm.
shouldn't. We know that that's not the solution. And so can you
Exactly.
speak a little bit about, like, what do you tell people that are like, I burned my bridges, nobody likes me, right? Nobody
Mhm.
wants to be around me. And
Mhm.
my grandpa's so lucky that he has family around him, but I think it's not the same for everybody. Not everyone has that same fate.
Mm. Yeah, that honestly speaks to a situation that's happening in my family now, and what my sister's going through, a difficult divorce with an alcoholic ex-husband who has created a lot of damage, especially in these last few years, and he's burned a lot of bridges. There really isn't a support system there for him, which has actually made the substance use worse.
Mhm.
And I'm stuck in this position of like, I understand the addiction. I see where you're coming from. However, you've also hurt so many people in the process and has lost a lot of respect from people because of these cycles that he's been through. Um, but one of the biggest pieces I think for me when I am working with folks is acknowledging, right, that we have to acknowledge that we created damage in this process and that it wasn't necessarily 100% our fault, right? Like an addiction is difficult. It is really hard for us to come to a place where we are no longer using these substances, but in that process, those behaviors, like we have to be responsible for those behaviors and the damage that we've made and heal. There's no way for us to move forward if we don't heal and acknowledge these pieces, right, that are huge in this addiction, and then hope that our family can take to our apologies and show them that we've been able to manage and change that perspective that we've had and that we're trying to continue the sobriety. But also the huge piece too in our families is to understand that this is a process that will happen for life, right? This is something that is going to continue forever, and that there might be relapses, and that we can't be upset about that because that is a part of addiction, is relapses. That is a huge piece. Um, Especially when there are triggers, right? We're all human. We have triggers and things happen. But for that person who has the addiction to ask for help before it goes too far. And those are the pieces that are really important, is for us to provide that community when we can and join in the healing when we can, but also that there are boundaries, and that if we've crossed some of those boundaries, that it's not necessary for us to accept that forgiveness. And I think that's super important, because just because someone is going through the process of healing and going through this addiction and trying to stop their substance use, and that's great, and we love to hear it and we love to see it, but you've crossed a boundary that I don't think can ever be repaired, right? And I can accept your apology and also move forward, right? So really finding that balance and what works for you, because every single person is going to be completely different, and we can't just say like all alcoholics are like this and all meth addicts are like this, because it's not true. It's absolutely not true. Everyone has a different trajectory, including people who have addictions.
So you're saying make the peace with, like, that's kind of what I'm hearing with the people that I deal with that do have addiction issues or that have burned bridges. But for my own healing, it's like, don't, I guess, forgiveness, which is really hard to come to, right? Like, especially
Yeah,
when you felt disrespected, right? Like for so many
for
years or
sure.
whatever. But then also, I guess, don't hold the grudge, right? Like, understand is a part of the solution, understanding, but then also, if they never come to terms, like, like hold themselves accountable, and they can't, a lot of people can't see it, right? They're so deep into their stuff for years that they're like, they have no idea that
Yeah,
their behavior was so damaging. But I guess what I'm hearing from you is like acceptance, right? Like, put your boundary up, but not be upset, not be mad, and I guess work on that, because that's the hard part. When
yeah,
someone close to you hurts you and breaks your heart,
for
and you're
sure.
like, your whole world, I feel like, crashes. And then you got
Yeah.
to deal with that, and it's like, man, I had nothing to do with this. This was your
Mm,
shit, right? That you brought onto me
mhm,
or whatever family members.
mhm.
But I guess that's what I'm hearing, right? Like making
Yeah,
peace and moving
yeah,
on, not being
yeah,
upset.
definitely. Yeah, definitely. I think the huge piece is understanding, being in a place where I can understand why the behaviors happen, accept that they happen, and then decide, do I want to reintegrate in this relationship, whether that's because I'm a family member who's supportive or I'm a spouse who wants to be back with my partner, and then moving forward, right? We cannot continue to go back to this past without being able to move forward and understanding that this is a journey that will continue forever. And for folks who have an addiction and burnt the bridges, tried to apologize, but just are not able to get back to that, finding a new support system, because that's always possible. There's always the possibility of finding a new support system, whether that means that I go to AA, NA, other groups like DBT groups, individual therapy, and then maybe even going out of my way to build new relationships. It's scary, but it's possible.
Yeah. And that's so true. And I think about it in my own experience. Like I understand, right? The way I was raised and like my choices. I accept the way my parents are and I'm never going to change them. I think that was the hardest part for me to accept, because I remember my early childhood, I would always ask them, or, we'd be bumping heads on like them changing, but I had to change. So that's me accepting like who they are and honoring them, and then healing and moving forward. So that, to me, that's me setting my boundaries, me learning in when to engage with them and not, so it doesn't trigger me into like something else. So that's like where I'm at right now, is learning how to set boundaries, because prior to therapy I never even knew what boundaries meant or even heard that word, right?
Huge.
And that's a
Absolutely.
tough one within our like culture. Like my therapist explained to me, like our Hispanic culture, we're so enmeshed with our relationships. So I'm learning how to like, like not be enmeshed, but like I still want to be close with my family. I don't want to kick them out of my life, but I'm learning to unmesh and learn these roles and, set the boundaries, which I'm struggling with. And it's not an easy journey. I'm not saying it's all rainbows and butterflies. It's very challenging. I'm like crying to Cindy almost every other week, or my therapist, where it's just like, I don't know what to do. But then it comes with time. You just got to put yourself out there and be willing to put yourself in those tough situations. And it'll like come with time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest pieces as well is that educational piece. How do we start bringing in some of that education early on,
Mm-hmm.
right? I don't think it's ever early enough to start these conversations respectfully and age appropriately, but these conversations we should be having these conversations within our families. That's kind of where it starts, right? If I can be in my nuclear family and have these discussions, we are a family that is one step closer to healing within our community, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then it's our family, then it's our community, and then it's like the world, right? But that's a lot to
Mm-hmm.
handle. But we can start within our families, and we can change these dynamics when we acknowledge and we understand and identify that they are harmful and that they have caused a lot of problems from generation to generation. And it's really up to the person who finally gets to the place, like you, Jessica, where you've been able to say, I see it. I know it. This is a problem and it shouldn't continue, and it stops here with me. And
Mm-hmm.
now you have the opportunity to show your kids, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
this is my journey and I can make mistakes and also move forward. And now I want you to learn that you can make mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge it, ask for forgiveness, and move forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's incredible to say about ourselves. I think we're starting to see these generations, including ours and generations younger than us, that are starting to acknowledge and say these behaviors are toxic, these behaviors are not okay. And we cannot continue these habits because they are harmful. And we don't want to continue these harmful behaviors, these harmful habits that continue to go from family generation to generation. But it's super important, right? That educational piece, I think it goes so much more than, learning about trauma. It's also about like what happens in our brain, like quite
Mm-hmm.
literally, right? When I am using a substance, my brain is altered, especially if I'm using substances long term.
Mm-hmm.
My brain chemistry is literally changing so that when I'm using the substance, that's the only time that I'm feeling okay. And that's hard, right? How do we come out of that? It's really difficult.
Yeah.
This is nice. I like this. um, I think, like you're saying, a big part of the solution is educating ourselves on all of this stuff, but also it starts with us, right? Because um, I think another big part for me, I'm really close to my grandma, and she has an eating disorder, and she's had one since, I want to say it got really bad when my dad passed away for her. Because she never did drugs or alcohol or whatever, because just it's not in our culture, you know, like, so, but she really got attached to food. And it's hard for me sometimes when I go over, where it's like her diseases are strongly related to the foods that we eat, but we continue to eat it. And I get so mad because I've changed that, you know, like I'm clean, you know, I eat healthy and I try to change my nutrition a lot. But my mom tells me a lot too, like, don't go and visit your grandma who you don't see often, who you love as your own mom, and then shame her because she is eating this food. And then, you know, and it's not just my grandma, it's all of our family, like the way that we eat. And it's like,
Right.
you have to make those changes within yourself,
Yes.
and still be able to come together with your family and not feel differently, because we can't have a party without alcohol. We can't have a party without weed, without this specific types of foods that I'm like, oh, I'm gonna feel like shit if I indulge in this.
Yeah.
And it's like working on yourself a lot, right? Because we are a huge influence to the people, just how they influenced us. We're influencing that new generation, right? Our nieces and nephews, our kids, and that creates a ripple effect. And so I think it's crazy to talk about because we're still in it, right, Jess? Like we don't get it yet. Like we're still like, I mean, you Jessica opens up a lot about her situation, and I do too, a lot, especially in the podcast too, you know, where I'm like, I don't get it. I get it, but I'm in the middle of it. Like I know where my end goal is, but like you said, it's a journey. The end goal isn't, you're not going to get it, right? I guess it's about always getting better and forgiveness and moving forward and setting new goals. And so I don't know, I think that's what I'm hearing, right? Like that it starts a lot at the individual level, and that can be very powerful for our families, even, you know, our immediate families.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. It really does start with us and our healing and the changes that we make within our own individual self. And also, like you said, it influences the people that are watching us, right? Like our family members, our cousins, our nieces and nephews, our kids. But also, you know, like I am a huge believer in calling out, or and not necessarily like in a bad way. It's more of like kind of inserting a little bit of information here and there within my family if I feel comfortable doing so. And in my family, I'm that person, right? I'm the person who's like, okay, here we go again. Karla's gonna say something, right? But I love that. I love that I'm that person. I love that I am the person who is like, no, this cannot continue, or that behavior is not okay, and this is why, right? Like these are the damages that happen when we do these things. And it's because I care for you. It's because I love you and I want you to be a better version of yourself, like I am working on myself. And it's a journey that we can have together, right? And using that as a way to bring my family in, for them to acknowledge some of these behaviors. But I hear a lot, you know, within our community, Latino, Hispanic community of like, well, they're older, they're never going to change. And that might be true. There might be a lot of things that they might not change, but we can be that little spark that even starts that reflection of like, oh my gosh, Karla said this, and now I've been thinking about it, and now I'm seeing it, and now I know that it's true. So even just being that little spark in the family of having these difficult discussions, and being truthful and honest and holding space for those conversations.
Well said.
Yeah, I felt like I was in a therapy session. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
You can bill her after, Karla. She can do that. She's a license.
I know how we owe you money. I know. No, thank you so much. Yeah, I've told you this a million times, Karla, you know, like this conversation we've been wanting to have, but this was perfect. I feel like we were ready finally. the Primas podcast is kind of coming to an end. And so I'm like, we have to have it before it ends because I wanted it since the beginning.
I know.
So thank you so much. I think we provided solutions throughout the whole entire thing. And then once we start promoting for this, I'll add all of the stuff that you talked about, like the books. And so if there's other references, you know, because I feel like this conversation can be had for a really long time where it's just like, well, what about this? What about that? You know? And so yeah, we'll include all of those resources. Yeah, any last thoughts? See, I wrote all of this stuff and I didn't even talk about it because we went to a different place, which is beautiful. You know, it's more natural that way.
Yeah, definitely. No, I also have a whole bunch of stuff that I can send to you if you are wanting that. I have a lot of like visuals of like what our brain looks like with and without substances. I think oftentimes that can be super helpful in just kind of seeing what does it look like and why it's so difficult for us to stop, right? But yeah, I think like you said, there was a lot of solutions that we provided within the podcast, but there's so many more, right? Like legislation changes, like etc. So I mean, these topics are really amazing. I think I'm grateful that you held the space, both of you, for these conversations to be had. And like we mentioned earlier, it starts with us. So whoever this reaches, I hope that they are able to reflect on some of like the family dynamics that happen within their own individual nuclear families, and hopefully that can be the start of that change for them as well. And I really appreciate that you were able to come together and have me be a part of this change, whether that's for us individually or for anybody else who watches this. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Oh,
Thanks, Karla.
Yeah, thank you so much. And whoever is listening, like you said, you're not alone. We're in this together. It's not easy, right? As we keep hearing, but I this conversation to me told me, keep going. We're just two, right? Like we're doing the right thing. And it feels hard and so lonely because it's like, no one understands me, but it's like, it's hard, right? It's hard, it's scary, but you're not alone. We are with you. We are in the struggle. Thanks again, Karla. Thanks, Jessica, too, for sharing. And yeah, let us know what you thought of this episode, you guys.
Bye.